This is Pooka with another beta tutorial. Beta has technically ended, but I've kept the game running, and I'm doing some more tutorials today. This is a quick overview of the guides. The grid is pretty much the same as the Little Big Planet grid. The only real difference is visual. It's a bunch of dots rather than lines. It also has finer adjustments. Little Big Planet just had a few different grid settings, and the grid here can go down very, very small or very, very large, depending on the scale that you're working on. And it will always default back to 1 when you leave a wet level and come back again. Stay upright is self-explanatory. Things stay upright. The precise move feature is something that it becomes grayed out when you turn on the grid because the grid overrides it. But precise move, when you grab something and move it, rather than moving all over the place, it just goes one direction at a time. It shows you what direction you're going with it. You can go in any direction, but you can't just do free movement. It's very precise that way. And with rotation, when you rotate, you get this little number here, and it shows you how many degrees you're rotating, and and you can also only rotate in one direction at a time. So then let go, grab again, and now I can rotate the other way. So if I cancel all of that out, and precise move also has the grid space or local space features. If you take something and just sort of move it any old which way, and then you turn the grid back on, it's now off the grid, but if we want the grid to align to this object, you press L1 and triangle, and now the grid is aligned here. That will affect your precise movement when you turn off the grid. Now the grid has been realigned to this object, but if you didn't want to do that changing of the grid, we'll put the grid back to default just by going anywhere where there's no object and realigning the grid that way. If we do precise move with local space, we'll just turn this off for a minute and get a strange angle here, so we're not on the grid anymore. If we do local space, we still have the precise movement, but now it's in relation to the object itself, rather than it being in relation to the grid. So you can do either one that suits your needs. The floor is only there for a frame of reference. The grid by default will be aligned with the floor, but as I just showed, you can change the alignment of the grid. That's just so that when you go really far down, really far up, you always have that frame of reference. And if I remove this piece in the middle, you can see that's marking the center of the level, and when you start in a new level, you automatically always start in the center. But when you're starting a playable level, you can start the player anywhere that you want.
Question, probably not relevant. Do you change the scale of that grid that the floor is showing? What is that just called, the floor grid? It's just the floor.
It's just showing the floor, and there's no scale change. You can, when you change, if you turn on the grid and you change the size of the grid, it doesn't affect the floor.
So there'd never be a need to really change the scale of that floor?
No, and the floor, it doesn't actually affect anything. It's only there as a visual reference. If we go and bring out a... oops, I'm in the wrong way. Let's see. If we go and bring out a ruler and bring it out here and turn it around, you can sort of see the ruler is showing a 1 meter by 2 meter rectangle, and that's obviously just virtual space. That's the kind of scale that the floor is on. So you can use it as a frame of reference for scale and for where the original center of the level is.
Cool, so the 2 meters would represent, like our default puppet tool is 2 meters tall, I'm guessing that way.
The default puppet tool I think may actually only be 1 meter tall, but that's a good thing to segue into the next thing, which is auto guides. And the best way to explain auto guides is to show it. The auto guides are in the gameplay gear, which is the same place as the puppet. This is the auto guide gadget. When you bring it out, it looks like that. I'll show it with the puppet. If you bring out a puppet normally, this is the size of the puppet in reference to the default floor grid. If I bring out a puppet normally, I can take it and I can rotate it around any way I want, and I can rescale it. If I drop the puppet and I go back in here and I turn on my auto guides, and now I go and I grab a puppet, as soon as I get near the floor, the puppet is snapping to the floor. and I can't change the scale of the puppet. I can rotate it around on the surface of the floor, but I can't take it and like tilt it sideways or at some weird angle. And I'll set it down, and we'll look at the puppet really quickly and open its logic chip, and then we can see what the auto guides are. This is that tool that you can just grab out of the gadgets menu. If we look at it, it has surface snap enabled, and there's no orientation defined. It's just a snap to the surface, so that means that it wants to grab onto whatever is the nearest floor surface, lock onto it, but you can still rotate on that surface. And stay upright is enabled, and that will override, even if you don't have stay upright switched on in your guides. If your auto guides are on and you take something like the puppet that has the stay upright auto guide, it will stay upright no matter what. It also has the scale minimum and maximum are both defined at 1, so that's preventing you from changing the scale when that auto guide is active. And it's, again, the auto guides are just here in the guides menu, and you can turn that off and on as you want to. The studio lighting is really handy when your lighting effects, shadows, colors, all that are getting in the way. If we turn that on, the sky turns to a neutral color, so now we're not getting any sort of bounce back of light, and there are no cast shadows anywhere. So every side of the puppet, we can see all the same kind of detail, and this can be really good for doing sculptural things. But when you turn it on, you need to remember to turn it off again later, because if you go and you start trying to tweak effects and things like that, of course, you're not going to see the actual result because the studio lighting is on. And so we'll move on then. That's all of guides in the assembly menu. Get rid of that puppet. And now we'll move on to looking at guides in the sculpt and paint modes. So now we're going to go into modes, and we're going to look at guides in the sculpting and painting mode, starting with sculpt mode. We turn on guides here, we'll see that we still have the floor, studio lighting, precise movement. Over here we have the grid snap and stay upright. Obey auto guides is not an option here because auto guides only apply in assembly mode. There's no auto guide feature within painting, but you can say stay upright, and then your shape will not change from its default vertical orientation. We also have some extra guides. We have surface snap, which was also an option in the auto guides, and it does pretty much the same thing, but here now my shape is snapping onto the surface of the floor that I have there. That doesn't mean that it's going to become part of the floor. If I go and I start drawing a little bit here, and it's snapping just according to the orientation that I rotated it to, and you can rotate it around, and it stays snapped, the center is snapping there. If I go out, now this is its own free sculpture. So that's just a way of getting something on a flat surface or a curved surface if you want to use a curved surface. You can go and start a new sculpture, and with surface snap still on, now it snaps to all the surfaces that are visible. So it's snapping to the last sculpture surface that I made. Turn that off. Tentacle snap, it looks like surface snap at first until you start going with it, and then you can draw in any direction you want. So it's only anchoring the starting point for every individual stroke, and the stroke I just made now becomes another place for an anchor point. So if you want to make sure that you have an overlap in your brush strokes or your sculpt gestures, you can use the tentacle snap for that. Turn that off and move over here to mirror. And actually, before I start that, I'm going to mention that mirroring and kaleidoscope effects, it's really handy with both of those to turn on the grid just for when you get started. And the reason for that is that when you make multiple sculptures or paintings or combination of the two, and you want them to have the same point of origin so that they all line up with each other to be grouped together as one, it really helps just to have something on the grid as a starting point. So I'm just going to click once to start it, and now that, oops, I think I didn't actually turn on mirroring. So mirroring is on now, and the grid snap is on. click once and that gives you a starting point. Now that mirror is visible. I move away from it, that mirror stays there. If I back up, now that my mirror has changed, if I want to rotate around 45 degrees and start there, now the mirror, it's aligning to the grid, so it's actually going on 90 degrees. And from here now I can sculpt any way that I want. I can turn off the grid and do whatever I want with that.
Wow.
But it's really helpful just to have your starting point be on the grid for the sake of lining things up later on. And you can do mirror in combination with the kaleidoscope effect. We'll look at the kaleidoscope just quickly here. You get to choose how many parts there are on the kaleidoscope. It defaults to 5. So what we're seeing here is 5 cubes all on top of each other, and I'm going to turn the grid on again, and now they're staying upright. So I click once for a starting point. That's now the center of my kaleidoscope effect. I'll turn the grid back off, and I can move these pieces however I want. I can have, from here I can change the number. My center point still stays, but I could make it now 8, and they're all oriented around the same center. If I just do a little bit of a stroke there with the sculpture, and now I go and I take the move tool and I grab it, getting a little bit of a lag here because it's such a complex shape, but they all move pretty much as one. I'm going to delete those and switch over to the stamp tool because it's a little easier. So let's say I do something like that, and then I can also turn on the mirror, and now every facet of that kaleidoscope has its own little mirror built into it. Now, if I turn those off, I'm just back to a normal shape. But if I drop my shape and I just use my move tool here, they're still all locked into their kaleidoscopic mirrored effect. And that is, as far as I know, that can't be switched off once you have painted down or stamped down a shape. It's locked into that kaleidoscope or mirror effect in sculpture mode. That's not the case in paint mode, and we'll get onto that in a minute. So I will leave those there, and I'll exit out of here, and then we'll look at paint mode and the guides. And we have all the same effects, the surface snap, the tentacle snap. So I won't go over those again, except to show really briefly that with surface snap painting, when you have it surface snapped, you can rotate the shape around on that plane, but you can't rotate it off of the plane, so it's always going to stay flat against that surface. And it will snap to all the visible surfaces, just like with the sculpture. And I'm going to look really briefly at the kaleidoscope, and I'm going to turn the grid on, turn on the kaleidoscope. It's gone back to 5 because now I'm in a new creation, or sorry, I'm in a painting now. I'm in a new mode, new little object I'm making, so it's defaulted back. And I'm going to use the grid because I used it before. I can use it to line up with this thing that I had in the sculpt. And so now my kaleidoscope has the same center. I'll turn off the grid. Now I can do a painting that is aligned with the sculpture. If I want to, I can turn on surface snap. And I made these when I had 8 parts on the kaleidoscope and the mirror turned on. So now I can do this, and I can paint onto the surface of these things that I just stamped down. So now we've got a pretty crazy effect there with the kaleidoscope. And the painting can also just be moved freely away from the sculpture. It's not part of the sculpture because it's a painting, it's totally separate. I should have probably done them in separate colors to make that a little easier to see. But if you want them to stay as one, you can group them together. And now they stay as one. And you can ungroup them again, and they are free moving. I'll come back to merging of paintings again later, but this is an option here. It looks like very similar to grouping, but there's a really important difference, which is that once you merge, there's no option to unmerge. You can undo it, but if you merge and you save and you leave the creation and come back to it, you cannot unmerge that again. So if you're going to merge paintings, I very much recommend saving it, remixing it, because that creates a new version, and then merge the remix. Don't ever merge your original. Always keep your original unmerged. If we merge this painting now, you might assume that that is going to turn all of those paint strokes into one, but that's not actually the case. What it's done is now when we go in here, the guides are all, the mirror and kaleidoscope are still on, so I'm going to turn those off. And as we saw with the sculpture, when I turned off the mirroring and the kaleidoscope, I moved those pieces around, they still followed the mirroring and kaleidoscope guides. With the painting, now that I've flattened the painting, these are no longer locked in to the kaleidoscopic and mirroring effects. So now each of these brush strokes has become something independent. So again, it doesn't turn all the brush strokes into one stroke, but it does remove any of the guide effects that you have in place. And we'll talk more on a later tutorial about the other functions of merging, but the really important thing is just to always, always save a new version before merging a painting, because now it's merged, there's no unmerge button.
And no undo. Okay.
And, well, you can undo from here. I can back up in the steps and undo to where it's no longer merged. But if I were to save and leave and come back, that undo is no longer going to work, and then you will have lost the original version of the painting. So that's it for guides, and the next segment of the tutorial will be cloning while scoped in versus scoped out on sculptures and paintings.